Hey guys, today I'm going to discuss the Zelda timeline with you, the one that's officially released by Nintendo in the Hyrule Historia book. If you not aware of the timeline, I would recommend probably going and watching another video or looking up on the internet before listening to this video, because you'll probably be sort of confused. And also, this will it will most likely contain spoilers to many games, most notably Skyward Sword. So if you've yet to beat that game and want to remain spoiler free, I wouldn't watch this video until after you've beaten it. So continuing forward, the thing that I think probably many of you like me were shocked about is when looking at the timeline, there is not just one split, but two splits in the timeline. The first two you'd obviously know were the ones from Ocarina of Time, creating the child and adult timelines. So that makes sense. But apparently there's another split in Ocarina of Time, and that is what happens if you die. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that is probably the cheapest, easiest way of getting out of it for Nintendo. And overall is pretty much just bullcrap. So my problem with that is, obviously it's totally not even thought about, but even going past that, it creates the potential for any game in the timeline to have create a split in the timeline, at which point there really becomes timeline becomes pointless, and I think that's pretty dumb. Now this is what I was really shocked about after hearing this after beating Skyward Sword, I should say. If you've beaten the game, you'll notice how you early in the game you'll go back in time and you'll see Zelda, and she'll go into this sleep to keep the seal on demise intact. Then you go back to the future, at which point you end up acquiring the Triforce and destroying Demise, or the imprisoned, I guess he is in the future. You end up destroying him with the Triforce, and that wakes Zelda up in the future. But something that I think that Nintendo and the kind of game doesn't really elaborate on is how technically Zelda is still sleeping in the past. Now, after Zelda wakes up, she's kidnapped by Garahim, who is then she is taken back into the past, and Garahim uses her soul to resurrect Demise. So now, after Link defeats Demise and gets Zelda's soul back, they all go forward in time, where Impa stays behind. Then it's revealed that the old lady is Impa. So that leaves Impa in the past, and then what's not shown or stated is what happens to the Zelda who is still sleeping in the past. Now, it would be pretty easy to kind of guess that after Demise is defeated, Zelda would no longer need to keep the seal on the sealed grounds, and she would wake up along with Impa. That would probably be the first person that she sees. And it wouldn't take a very large stretch of the imagination to say that she told the residents probably recently moved up to Skyloft that they can come back down to the ground and live there, which would then in turn create another Hyrule. So then that would create another split in the timeline. Now, what I think would make a lot more sense is, instead of having a split in the timeline where Link fails in Ocarina of Time, if they took all of that and moved it over to the split created in Skyward Sword that for some reason don't really elaborate on. So after, say, they create the other Hyrule, which would make a lot more sense, since that Hyrule, the Hyrule in the older Zelda games, doesn't really seem to have much in common at all with the Hyrule of the newer games, aside from the name. So it would make a lot more sense to have a different Hyrule completely. So in this Hyrule, things would probably go well for a while until the everyone starts going after the Triforce, and then the Imprisoning War takes place, where the sages seal Ganon away, and then technically the first hero in this timeline would be the hero from A Link to the Past, which this wouldn't be really anything to actually base anything on, but it does seem kind of that that Link and the Link from the first Zelda games don't really, they have a lot more in common, and they don't really seem to be related to the other Links at all. So it would be a lot more, it would make a lot more sense to have this group of Links to be separate as well. And then that would also kind of make sense with the Master Sword, since at the end of Skyward Sword, the Master Sword technically doesn't exist in the timeline that I'm talking about. The Master Sword would only exist in the first timeline, the one that is officially stated by Nintendo. But if there is an alternate timeline, then the Goddess Sword would still be sitting up in Skyloft, which possibly could then be brought back down to the ground, at which point it would potentially fall into decay if people decided to make a place somewhere else. The statue could fall apart. That would create the Sacred Grove, which is what the Sacred Grounds would be after the Temple of Hylia is brought down on top of it. Or I guess it doesn't have to be. Either way, it would still kind of resemble the Sacred Grove where Link finds the Master Sword in A Link to the Past. Now, even though they do technically call it the Master Sword, if you look at it, it doesn't really look like the Master Sword at all. And aside from the coloring, kind of more resembles the Goddess Sword, which would not be a very large stretch. So that's kind of my theory and some supporting evidence about what would make a lot more sense than having Link die at the end of Ocarina of Time. Instead of creating that timeline, you'd have a timeline created in Skyward Sword, which Nintendo technically already did. They just decided not to place any games there. Instead, they just leave it blank. So, yeah. I'd like to hear your guys' comments, and if you agree with me, like if you want. I don't really need likes, I guess, but yeah, I would like to get this idea. You know, if you guys think it's a good idea, then I guess, spread it around. Maybe Nintendo might see it. Or at least maybe influence something. So, yeah. See you guys.